My name is Cathy Samuel and I'm based at the University of Reading in the UK, specialising in global security and disaster law. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce this masterclass to you now. By way of context, currently we have a gathering in Reading of global experts drawn from governmental, intergovernmental, practitioner, academic stakeholders to examine the critical issue of what does disaster risk reduction mean through the lens of international law. Much of the focus today in international discourse has been on science and technology, and as you'll discover through this masterclass, in order for key indicators and objectives on disaster risk reduction to be achieved, it's critical to better integrate legal tools. As you'll also discover during this masterclass, some of those relevant legal tools are more developed and others are less developed than others. And one of the primary objectives of this masterclass and of this symposium is to examine, one, what does that mean in terms of the development of future law policy and practice, and how might we make it more effective in practice. So today you're going to hear from a range of legal and non-legal experts. Just to give you a sense of the direction of the masterclass, first we will look at the global agenda, in particular at the level of the United Nations. Then we'll look at international legal frameworks, examples of regional frameworks, particularly for cooperation, and challenges and examples of how the disaster risk reduction agenda is incorporated into domestic law at the national level, and how ultimately it may impact upon disaster affected populations at the grassroots level. The experts you're going to listen to are drawn from a range of legal and non-legal backgrounds. Although the primary focus of this research symposium is on international law and the legal tools, we've embedded multidisciplinarity both into the symposium and this masterclass, because for the disaster risk reduction agenda to be successful, ultimately the legal tools must be better implemented and integrated with science and technology in law, policy, practice on the ground. A key issue that we're examining during this symposium is the law as it is and the law as it should be. And a key theme that I hope will permeate this masterclass is that whereas often there can be a misconception that law is only about restraint, that in fact properly used, law is a huge facilitator, particularly when it is embedded multi-sectoral with, for example, different ministries involved with disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management issues. So the law in this area is not perfect. Let me give you three key definitions before we go into any depth. The first is what the very concept of disaster is. As with many key issues and terms in international law, it has no universally agreed definition. However, in the margins of recent work undertaken by the International Law Commission on persons affected by natural disasters, a key element they examined were examples of existing definitions. And the one that I would refer you to as a starting point of the parameters of a disaster would be Article 3 of those International Law Commission articles. So if I may, will just read these to you. It defines disaster as meaning a calamitous event or series of events resulting in widespread loss of life, great human suffering and distress, mass displacement or large-scale material or environmental damage, thereby seriously disrupting the functioning of society. And in terms of what does that mean in practice? Well, it could be terrorist attacks, it could be industrial disasters, it could be cyber attacks, it could be sudden onset disasters like earthquakes, it could be slow onset disasters such as climate change and rising sea levels. It can be, to use the term, natural or man-made disasters. So the scope is broad, as indeed is the scope of disaster risk reduction. The second definition that I want to go on to is what is disaster law? Because that's a term that you're going to hear referred to several times in this masterclass. The first is to say that, as you will hear, there are specialist rules which are binding, and there's also codes and standards which are non-formally binding, specifically governing different aspects of disasters, whether it's preventing, for example, transboundary harm of the environment, whether it's how disasters are responded to, whether it's preventing loss of human life, for example, through nuclear disasters. There are, however, though, many different legal regimes which are relevant to disasters. Indeed, the breadth of topics that we're examining during this Disaster Risk Reduction Symposium it illustrates this point, in that it can touch on human rights law, environmental law, law of the sea. It could impact on humanitarian responses, construction law, law on property rights. Effectively, the list of legal regimes it may impact on are almost limitless. Where we're at the moment in terms of the development of disaster law is that where a disaster event is critiqued through existing legal regimes such as international human rights law, the law is evolving and developing as to how it interprets and responds through existing legal principles, but to new and evolving, for example, in this case, disaster-related events. One particular principle I would just like to highlight to you, which I believe is of particular importance to parliamentarians in terms of current and future law and policy making, is the principle of due diligence. What due diligence requires is for governments to take reasonable and appropriate measures in response, in this case, to preventing, mitigating the potential effects of, preparing better for, responding more effectively, recovering longer term from disaster events. So, for example, if in a country there is a known risk, whether because it's happened before or there's strong environmental, scientific evidence and so forth pointing to the likelihood of a particular disaster event, for example, to extreme weather, to mudslides, to landslides, to earthquakes, then there's a particular duty upon those in government to take the necessary measures required to prevent the loss of human life and to protect human life and to prevent damage to property as well. Then in the aftermath of a disaster event, to where, for example, there's been negligence or appropriate action was not taken, to investigate this accordingly and to where appropriate afford the victims of disaster events suitable reparation. The third and key concept that I'm going to talk about and explain is the concept of disaster risk reduction itself. Historically, both at the national, regional, international level, the primary focus was on the response element to disasters. And it was learnt that not only was that extremely costly in terms of human life and financially, but it was more effective to invest more financially and in terms of science and technology into preventing disasters from occurring at all, if possible, or mitigating their potential impact and being better prepared. So in 2005, the Hyuga framework on disaster risk reduction was introduced, and that ran until 2015, looking to shift the focus of the international community to what action should be taken prior to a disaster event occurring. Then this framework, it was updated in 2015 in the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, 2015 to 2030. And again, that continues the key focus on prevention, mitigation and preparedness. But now the additional features are it's broader in terms of its scope and parameters, including, for example, not only natural and man-made disasters, but thinking, for example, of biological hazards and how to improve health resilience that runs throughout the Sendai framework. In addition, it's trying to move away from shorter term responses and planning to longer term sustainable solutions, and also to engage all potentially interested and involved stakeholders in this, not only governments and international organisations, but also communities at the grassroots levels, non-governmental organisations, and equally the private sector in driving this agenda forward. Of particular interest to the focus on disaster risk reduction in international law is that it makes reference to the importance of legal tools. And that's what much of this masterclass will look at in terms of what are those legal tools, but also significantly how they might be better integrated in that multi-sectoral response. Just to mention too, there are other overarching principles of the Sendai framework. Two, I would suggest, of particular importance, particularly to those of you whose countries are particularly bad affected by, for example, extreme weather events, mudslides, landslides, and so forth, are the issues of early warning systems and build back better. I'm delighted to introduce our next expert, Professor Virginia Murray, Public Health Consultant at Public Health England, who is Vice Chair of UNISDR's Scientific and Technical Advisory Group. So Virginia, why does disaster risk reduction and the Sendai Framework Agenda matter to members of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association?
Do you know, this is a huge privilege to be with you, Katia, to talk about this. And I'm delighted you're doing this masterclass, because to me the Sendai Framework is the most incredible story of incredible, committed political negotiation. And I've had the privilege to sit through as an observer for much of this. I have been the United Nations International Strategy on Disaster Risk Reduction Vice Chair of their Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee for 9 years. And I sat the whole way through the development of and leading to the negotiations on the Sendai Framework. And I really want to have this opportunity to share it with my Commonwealth colleagues, who I know have been really actively engaged in this. So the Sendai Framework is something that has a vision. It's a vision about disaster risk reduction, because disasters really hurt governments. But most importantly, they're people. We need to save life, we need to save people's ability to live, we need to save the environment in which they live. We know that disasters, if you look at 2000 to 2012, cost trillions, have hurt billions, probably at least half our world's population, and have killed well over 1 million in those 12 years. But quite how we define this and how we understand these figures and how these figures can be used by parliamentarians is really difficult. So how has the change of the different types of events happened? Well, they've been very complicated. What we do know, if we look back over 30 years, we can see a significant increase in the numbers of floods and droughts. A lot of these storms, floods, droughts and other events are probably related to climate change, and that's coming through as a very strong message. But climate change is not something that parliamentarians can respond to easily, because it has a longer vision, a longer timeline. But disasters are here now, are here today, and shock governments, and indeed can result in downfalls of some governments. And the one thing we need in a disaster is the best leadership we can have. So why does 2015 really matter? Because we had the most incredible time. We had 3 UN landmark agreements that talked to each other, that were driven by the UN member states. They were all there because that's what the UN member states wanted. And of course, the Commonwealth nations are at the heart of these member states. So the first one is the Sustainable Development Goals, but the timeline for the Sustainable Development Goals really just rose in 15 years from the Millennium Development Goals that happened in 2000. The Climate Change Agreement has taken a bit longer, but of course is even harder to negotiate and will take time. But the Sendai framework has been evolving really since the 1980s. And it started initially with the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, huge leadership here from the Caribbean, from Barbara Carby and others who were much engaged. But then we moved to the Yokohama strategy that was agreed in 1994 in Japan. And then we set up this special secretariat underneath the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, followed by the Hyuga framework in 2005, which was agreed within the month, of course, of the terrible earthquake and tsunami that happened on the 26th of December 2004, with many hundreds, even thousands of deaths. So this time the Sendai framework was really driven because of the Japanese earthquake, tsunami and the Fukushima event. And the Japanese volunteered to host all the UN member states to come together finally after years of negotiations, some of which I sat through, some of which we were allowed to really contribute to, which brought together all these member states who sat behind their flags, who sat behind where they came from. And if they wanted to ask a question, they lifted their flag, they lifted their sign. And they talked, they shared, they discussed, they negotiated. Some words really caused problems like exposure, vulnerability, governance. But finally, these words were resolved. It was the most incredible experience to watch this and to be an observer through this from the scientific point of view. So it was agreed in March 2015 by those who were present. And then by the time we moved forward to the UN General Assembly in June, it was ratified and endorsed by the whole of the UN General Assembly. So every member state of the UN members have now adopted it. What does the Sendai framework really mean? Well, it's really about let's have disasters, let's not have them. So it has a very clear global outcome. It has 13 guiding principles. It has 4 priorities for action, 7 global targets. I'll take you through the targets shortly. But the global outcome to me is visionary. Difficult to achieve, possibly impossible, but it talks about prevent new and reducing existing disaster risk through the implementation of integrated and inclusive economic, structural, legal, social, health, cultural, educational, environmental, technological, political and institutional measures that prevent and reduce hazard, exposure and vulnerability to disasters, increase preparedness for response and recovery, and thus strengthen resilience. Isn't that a fantastic wish? So how are we doing it? There are 4 priorities for action. Understanding disaster risk, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, so spending some money to make sure we deliver better, but also enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. And I know my colleagues on this masterclass will be talking about this, but I'm concerned about obviously national and local levels, which is where our parliamentarians sit. But it doesn't work if we don't link to global and regional levels. Really critically, we should do that. So what does it address? Well, it actually addresses the strengthening of technological and scientific capacity to capitalise and consolidate existing knowledge and to develop and apply methodologies and models to assess disaster risk vulnerabilities and exposures to all hazards. That's quite an ask. So I use this cartogram, which you'll see, of all the different things that we would expect. Most people think it's just natural catastrophe. It's not. It's climatic catastrophe, environmental catastrophe, it's technological catastrophe. Of course, it's epidemic disease. What about humanitarian crises and migration? We've had huge problems with that. Political violence, very worrying. Geopolitical conflict. So much of the world is in conflict. There's even trade disputes when you can't access materials you need. And then, of course, financial shock, which means there's less money to invest in this. But the bit I really like about this proposal, this understanding of all hazards, is the question mark. What don't we know? So to me, I was extraordinarily privileged to be able to be the chair of the coordinating committee of the UN ISDR Science and Technology Conference we ran last year, and there's some really strong messages came out of it. We had a roadmap that was agreed, and in there was a call for support and stronger involvement of the use in science to inform policy and decision making within and across all sectors at all levels, but also develop expertise and personnel to use the statistics to develop policies for disaster risk reduction. Why? Because you have to access information. It's critical to successful disaster risk management, and you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And we need to measure. So people spend their money wisely, spend their political engagement appropriately. And I was delighted to tell you that on the 2nd of February this year, the UN General Assembly adopted a huge piece of work we'd been doing. We've agreed not only on these global targets, but also the 38 indicators that sit underneath them, and the terminology, the language, translated into the six major languages of the UN, so very accessible, not perfectly so, but very accessible, and hopefully fits with many of the Commonwealth needs. So, our big global targets, we've got them agreed. We need to reduce mortality. We need to reduce the number affected. We need to reduce the economic loss. We need to reduce damage to critical infrastructure, be it basic, healthcare, or educational facilities. For me as a medical doctor, the healthcare is critical, but it's not just the facilities, but it's also making sure they function. And we need to increase countries' abilities to understand what risks they run. So understanding a national risk register, possibly following a national risk assessment, planning so you have the resources you need, and then linking to international cooperation, something that I know our Commonwealth partners do very well and very helpfully. And then there's that wonderful one that the European Commission brought in, availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information assessment to all people by 2030. Wouldn't that be amazing if we can deliver that? So, we now have the indicators. I give you one, the global target A, it's about death. And actually counting deaths from disasters is much harder than you think. It's not just those who die at once. If you have a flood, it's not just those who drown. It could be those who get electrocuted, who suffer trauma because they get swept away. It could be those who get an infectious disease. It could be those who get so desperate that they commit suicide because they cannot resolve their issues. And that is why we're struggling so hard to make sure those indicators really reflect what each country needs and wants to do. But we're doing it in partnership. We're doing it to help every country to make sure they can deliver this. And that we can look at the other part of the indicators, which is about missing persons, which of course was a huge issue with the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, and in many others. So what we do now is every 2 years we have a global platform. We bring together, this time in Mexico, over 7,000 registrants, with many countries there, heads of state, but also all the communities at every level, be it local government, be it academics, business, meteorological organisations, whatever's going to help the most. And the great message at the end is the Chair's summary. And I'm just going to give you 2 quick points from the Chair's summary, which I hope will help our national and local governments. In it, though, is highlighted that resilience and sustainable investment depend on the ability to ensure integration and coherence across policy instruments and regulatory frameworks. Critical. We need to understand so that parliamentarians find it easier to do, and that we need to have this idea of building better, strengthening systems at national and local levels to help communities have policy frameworks and legal systems for reconstruction. There's a huge amount here. Each of these different statements take a lot of work. But let's also take the fact that we need to link the SDGs, the Paris Agenda, to the Sendai framework. If we do this, we'll have one system of monitoring, which might make everybody's lives easier, but also much better to deliver what's needed for parliamentarians. There's a declaration of local and regional governments that was issued at the global platform. The link is in my talk. You can have a look at it. It's only 3 pages, but I think helpful. And the final message from the United Nations was that the UN Risk Reduction Forum in Cancun closes with a call to harness data. If we don't have the data, we cannot manage. So my conclusion is that the Sendai framework, I know, is a voluntary framework, but the need for it is so clear, and parliamentarians are so critical to how we deliver this. And to have this opportunity to work with this masterclass is really exciting for me. To me, disaster risk reduction would extend to many different legal regimes. There could be soft, non-binding policy or hard, formal, binding law governing a broad range of disasters. But ultimately, delivery at national and local governments and communities in partnership with regional and international collaborations is key.
So our next expert is Isabelle Granger, who directs the Disaster Law Programme at the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent Societies. So Isabelle, could we start by you giving an overview of what the international legal framework relevant to disaster risk reduction law is?
At international level, there are a number of international legal instruments that are relevant to DR. As example, the Convention on the Prevention of Oil Spill, or the Convention that governs a nuclear accident. So these conventions request government to adopt mitigation action to prevent the occurrence of these disasters, and also request government to mitigate the impact of these disasters and adopt early warning systems, and of course implement in practice at national level the content of these international instruments. There are also other non-binding tools that are relevant to disaster risk reduction. The International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, together with UNDP, we have developed recommendations for lawmakers in order for them to strengthen their legal framework and mainstream disaster risk reduction at national level. And these recommendations, actually, this tool supports the implementation at national level of the Sendai framework.
And could you give us an overview of how this international legal framework gets translated at the national level?
So of course, implementations of law is essential for effective disaster risk management and effective disaster risk reduction. We have undertaken a comparative analysis of the legislation in place in 31 countries, and we have realized that there are a number of challenges that prevent effective disaster risk reduction legislation. In order to have effective disaster risk reduction legislation, the disaster risk management laws are essentials, so they can ensure that institutions are established, and they can also request that these institutions mainstream disaster risk reduction in their decision and plan. In addition to that, sectoral laws are also equally important, and it is really a challenge and an area of opportunities for government. In many opportunities, the governmental entities that manage different sectoral laws, such as building codes, environmental laws, the law responsible for the management of resources. In many cases, they do not coordinate together, and this is an area of opportunity. As these laws are essential and are essential to address underlying risk of urban and rural areas.
And in your experience, what are some of the principal challenges encountered by parliamentarians with implementation at the national level?
Well, communities are at the core of the work of the Red Cross, so we want to make sure that the voices of communities are heard. And in our research, we have evidence has shown that in some cases, there are legal provisions that are set out in laws, but unfortunately, they're not sufficiently detailed or comprehensive to allow for for implementation in practice. And one example of that are provisions regarding the involvement of communities in decision-making bodies, and also provision regarding the involvement of women and vulnerable groups in these decision-making bodies. So this is really an area that could be further improved.
So Isabel, as you know, issues of gender are very high up on the international agenda. How have you seen this outworked in relation to disaster risk reduction?
Well, after disasters, the occurrence of gender-based violence is often increasing due to various factors. A couple of years ago, the International Federation published a report called Unseen, Unheard, and some recommendations were made in this report regarding how disaster risk management law can address these issues. At the moment, we find ourselves we have undertaken additional research in Ecuador, Zimbabwe, Nepal, and as well literature review of at global level. So we want to be able to better understand how legal framework can better support and address these issues. One of the preliminary findings is that in many cases the prevention system that applies in normal time does not apply as efficiently in disaster response situation. And there again, there could be opportunities to strengthen the relationship between the various entities. So basically, in order for the disaster risk management systems to be better connected to the prevention system that would apply in normal time. So this is, again, I mean, this is still work in progress, but this is an area that we are exploring in order to be able to provide more precise recommendation in this area.
And finally, Isabel, could you outline what you envisage the future work of the IFRC being in relation to these issues?
In our research, we have evidence has shown that in some cases there are legal provisions that are set out in laws, but unfortunately they're not sufficiently detailed or comprehensive to allow for implementation in practice. And one example of that are provisions regarding the involvement of communities in decision-making bodies, and also provision regarding the involvement of women and vulnerable groups in these decision-making bodies. So this is really an area that could be further improved.
Our next expert is Dr. John Hopkins, who's a comparative public lawyer at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. So why is regional cooperation in disaster risk management, including disaster risk reduction, important?
Well, I think the thing to be remembered is that in most regions, individual states can't cope with the type of disasters that they're going to be able to deal with individually. It's a classic area that requires cooperation across boundaries. Even if the states may not be close to each other, they still will require pooling of resources. It's very rare for a state to have the sort of resources that are required to respond to a disaster, or even to develop risk averse, to prevent disasters themselves without, they can't keep it fallow. You can't keep those sort of resources fallow. You need to be able to use them. So the only way to manage that is to create a regional pool or operate across states.
And can you give any examples from, for example, the Asia-Pacific region of cooperation?
Yes, well, there's a number in the Asia-Pacific region of various different types. So you have, at the high end of the scale, you would see the ASEAN relationship, where you've got a formal regional organisation, which in the early 2000s created a specific organisation to deal with humanitarian disaster, the ASEAN Humanitarian Agency. This is then that's a formal agreement which allows states to pool resources, to give specific resources to the organisation. It creates formal warehouses and other resources that individual states can call on in an emergency. So that's your classic formal relationship, formal organisation. Alongside that, you'll get a lot more informal types of regional cooperation. You'll find this particularly in the South Pacific region, where regionalism is quite weak, where regional cooperation is quite weak, but it's a highly disaster-prone region. And because of that, we've got a number of NGOs working in the region, we've got the Pacific Forum, and we've got a number of national aid agencies, particularly AusAid and New Zealand Aid, who operate as an informal network to deliver some of these resources.
So what would you say are the principal differences between formal and informal disaster risk management regimes?
I think in a perfect world, a formal relationship is better. A formal organisation is better. It allows you to deal with things, legal issues. For example, simple things such as visas. If you're in a disaster response environment, you need people to get there quickly. The last thing you want to be doing is arranging visas for those staff required. If you have a formal agency, a formal entity set up, those things can be dealt with in advance. In addition, you can ensure that there is standardization of procedures, simple things which we don't think about, that radios are compatible, for example, that the different equipment is compatible. In an informal arrangement, it's more difficult to do these sort of things because you don't have that secretariat, that body of expertise in place. However, reality means that you can't always have a formal regional structure. The politics of the region maybe make it difficult, or alternatively there may be practical problems. The region itself may not function very effectively as a unit. So the formal one is better, but the informal is, given the limits that you have, still allows you to develop ad hoc responses to regional disasters.
That's very interesting. Are you able to give us any real-life examples, particularly from the Asia-Pacific region?
Yeah, most famously, ASEAN responded effectively to Typhoon Hainan, which in Southeast Asia. That allowed quite small numbers, but for example, ships were able to be released and taken to the region very swiftly, to Myanmar. And in addition, food and other sort of resources were able to be delivered quickly. That's your classic formal arrangement. That was unusual for the region. It's not a region that has strong regional politics, but it shows you that the states realise that it's an area where they have to cooperate, and it certainly was effective, if in a small way. You see a lot more informal relationships in the South Pacific. We have seen that there is a formal treaty to do with maritime safety between France, Australia, and New Zealand, and a number of informal cooperation between those states and the smaller South Pacific states, which are unable to, for example, put naval resources on the ground. So all those issues are handled by the OECD nations in the region. The one thing I would say is you can see the limits of informal arrangements. New Zealand's firefighter, for example, have fought in forest fires in Australia under a close but informal arrangement, and that has led at times, most recently, to a crisis where the New Zealand firefighters were trained differently and ended themselves having to be rescued, I suppose is the prosaic term, by the Australian, largely because they didn't have the same equipment and they were trained in a different way. And that's your difficulty with utilising an informal arrangement.
And finally, how would you recommend that parliamentarians could champion taking forward disaster risk management frameworks at the regional level?
Well, I think in general they need to be encouraged. It's traditionally somewhere that states will defend their sovereignty. The defence of your population is seen as fundamental to the Westphalian state model. The problem is, in the modern world, as states develop, they are increasingly at risk from disasters, and they need to cooperate. And they need encouragement to cross that Rubicon, to get involved with other states. And this is the dichotomy we have in the Asia-Pacific region. All the states know, they must know, that they can't cope individually, and therefore they need to cooperate. But the political will is often lacking. So encouraging that political will is one thing. I think the second point is that these agencies can be difficult to be held accountable because the executives are cooperating outside the realm of the traditional domestic law. So I think parliamentarians have to be aware of that and have to be alive to the fact that they may have to treat their role differently, and to realise that they're dealing with regional organisations which are outside their traditional scope of competence. So that means they've got to upskill or keep close contact or close understanding of these new areas of policy development.
John, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next expert is Simon Whitbourne, who has extensive experience of working within central and local government as a solicitor, and who recently opened his own practice specialising in public, disaster and maritime law. So Simon, to what extent do you think that international legal framework impacts at the national level?
Thank you very much. Well, I think the impact has been tremendous, and that's one of the joys of being here at Reading today at this conference and symposium on disaster risk reduction laws, to recognise the contribution international law can make towards improving disaster risk reduction. We've had, in the years I've been working in this field now, significant contribution from the international community, but particularly the International Federation of the Red Cross Societies, in developing, for example, its Model Act and its checklist and handbook. And I think states are very well aware now of the need to improve at domestic level their disaster laws. You know, there have been certain international conventions which have tried to operate in particular fields to develop better laws. And again, the purpose of this symposium is also look towards the development of more generic international treaties to deal with disaster laws. But I think the difficulty is that however optimistic we may be, it will take some time before those laws come into place. And so that's why it's even more important for domestic legislators and domestic laws to make their contribution to fill the gaps in the meantime.
So you said that international law has impacted at the domestic level. Can you give some examples?
Well, there have been some international conventions which have made a significant contribution. I think people immediately think of the Chernobyl disaster and the 3 conventions which helped regulate the nuclear industry, which were agreed by the international community very quickly after that disaster. There have been a number of other ones to deal with industrial accidents, but I think one of the best examples are in the maritime field, where because of the common interest in maintaining consistent standards among the maritime industry, both to protect lives of those who sail on ships and also to avoid pollution incidents, there have been a number of widely accepted conventions brought into place, such as the Safety of Life at Sea, which actually dates back almost to the post-Titanic inquiry, and also more recently pollution conventions, which have responded to disasters at sea by putting in place measures to enable states to be notified, to enable states to take intervention action on the high seas if they feel threatened by pollution. You know, they are good examples because they have been accepted, and also they have a novel approach that most recently states have agreed that their implementation of those conventions should be subject to a mandatory audit from the International Maritime Organization.
So what role do you think that law, and therefore parliamentarians, should have on disaster risk management at the domestic level?
I think that outside of war, how a state responds to a disaster is one of the greatest tests of both the government and indeed the political system. And you only have to look to the criticism levelled at President George W. Bush after Katrina and the Japanese Prime Minister after Fukushima to realise how significant failing to deal with a disaster adequately is to their own political, to their government's continuance. Even here in the UK, in dealing with the foot and mouth outbreak, Prime Minister Tony Blair acknowledged that he felt it was one of the greatest tests of his administration, how he dealt with that emergency. So it's very significant for politicians and governments as to how they deal with disaster. Now, a number of people will say that it can be left to guidance, it's a matter for operational intervention by emergency service personnel, and the law shouldn't have much of a response. But I'd actually say that no, it's far more important for the law and legislators to set in place a framework which ensures that if something does happen, then those key personnel on the ground are able to work effectively and flexibly.
Do you think that more laws and increasing role for lawyers is the answer?
I think there are a number of people who say that lawyers should keep well away from disasters. When I first started, I went on a training course where the trainer looked at me and wondered what on earth a lawyer was doing there. And he was quite right in the sense that the last thing you want is a lawyer poring over whatever an emergency service personnel have been up to in dealing with a disaster. But equally, I think he was quite wrong, because I think one of the first persons you should speak to is the lawyer, or indeed the legislator, because if we make sure that the laws are adequate, robust and set up in a correct way, ensure the framework for them to actually carry out their job if and when a disaster strikes.
And what in particular do you perceive as being the key role for parliamentarians in this process?
I think the first role, most obviously, is to try and put in place a robust set of laws which will enable the emergency service personnel to do their job. So it's both in terms of ensuring that there's adequate planning, understanding of risk, but also putting in place measures which enable a response if, unfortunately, a disaster does ever happen. Second most important one, I suspect most people would say, is resourcing. That there needs to be adequate resourcing, because it's all very well having the laws in place, but without the money behind it and the right personnel, and indeed exercising and making sure that everybody knows what they're supposed to do in an emergency, those laws will fall flat. I think also trying to establish a culture of risk awareness, both amongst the agencies who are involved, because disasters cross many boundaries of departments, but also amongst the general public, to make sure that they appreciate what risks apply in their particular location, and they're educated about what they can do if and when a disaster arises.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next expert, Professor Ros Cornforth, who's the director of the Walker Institute at the University of Reading, who brings a multidisciplinary scientific perspective to this DRR Masterclass. Ros, so in terms of the key priorities at the grassroots levels, what would you identify as the principal ones?
The priority issues for disaster risk reduction now stem from the range of climate change impacts on the ground. So the debate we know that climate change is happening, that's a certainty. But what we're now looking at is how we as a global society prepare, respond, mitigate crises as they happen. And in that process, actually think about how we can not only build people's resilience, but enable transformative changes that really impact on people's lives, real lives on the ground. And to do that, we have to think about the cascading chain of interactions. So, for example, climate change is not just about more extreme droughts, more extreme flood events. People in Africa depend heavily on agriculture. 70% of GDP in Africa is based around agriculture. More flooding, more drought, that's disrupting these primary agricultural systems that people depend on. It's destroying the fragile infrastructure that people depend upon. It's disabling people's capacity to generate hydroelectric power, which is key to energy. Coupled with that, you have rising populations, pressures on land, and that's increasing conflict in the region. So climate change is impacting people's basic livelihoods in every single way through their water security, food security, financial security. It's threatens stability of countries. So when we think about DRR, we have to take a holistic approach and think about how we can really tackle the big issues, understand new knowledge to enable people to build back better lives and to not only be resilient to these more frequent events, but actually to have transformed livelihoods to cope better.
So from your own significant experience, particularly on the African continent, could you give us one or two examples of how this translates into practice?
So thinking about the work that we do, we've been involved in a programme called Rainwatch, for example, which started about 6 or 7 years ago. And it was about trying to ensure that information in real time was accessible to the people that, for example, the droughts or the floods were impacting. And that sounds not such a tremendous problem, but it is. The actual, just being able to bring data into the national organisations that manage data, so for example in this case talking about the National Met Services, processing that data and then being able to distribute that information, and not just the information as another probabilistic forecast, but actually in a way that people can take action in their real lives, is a tremendous challenge. So Rainwatch has been an example of this, working across the region, building long-term sustainable partnerships is terribly important. As an academic community, our first area of work is around research, but to enable Rainwatch to be built up, for example, we had to build long-term partnerships, we had to build trust in our relationships to enable people to feel comfortable and confident about sharing data, which is one of the major issues on the ground in the Sahel. And then we had to work and bring in social sciences so we could actually think about how do we communicate the information so that people can actually take action on it. And one of the big priorities at DRR at the moment in the world is everybody is thinking about the global framework for climate services, climate information services. And there has been a big missing piece. We as a global society, I don't think we are yet delivering the S in climate information services. And this is one of the things that we're looking at in all the projects that we're working in. Another example is thinking about how you actually build climate resilient health services and structures. And that's about ensuring interventions such as distribution of malaria, of mosquito nets, happens in a timely fashion. How do you make sure that infant feeding programs happen at the right moment if you have slow onset drought? So these health interventions have to pull climate information through in a timely fashion and at the right point. But as we've been looking at this work, we see that there are other foundational pieces that need to be built in to support the development of climate resilient services.
So how important do you believe it is to integrate legal tools with science and technology in the furtherance of key Sendai goals?
It's absolutely fundamental. I spoke a little earlier about the connectivity, the connectedness between the climate change impacts, the issues around water, food, financial security, how that's linked to stability of countries and therefore the long-term success of a society actually. We're in a new world, new development context where you have to look at issues from an interdisciplinary perspective. And one of the big issues around disaster risk reduction actually is the siloed nature of, for example, government agencies. Met services often are not working in a joined up way with the national disaster management agencies. Ministry of Health might not be connected to the Met Service to be able to trigger climate resilient health services effectively. So there is a real import to bring people together within the government structures. And as part of bringing the government structures together, we found that in our work there is a fundamental missing piece, which is around that legal infrastructure. How do you translate the big international frameworks that were launched in 2015, not only the Sendai framework, but also the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement? These were all launched in 2015. And yet, how do you translate those into national systems and address the strategic priorities of the governments? And for this, we need to bring in issues around the legal structures that need to be put in place, and in particular, the disaster law is a fundamental tool that can be used to support the anticipation and the response, and then the reshaping of both institutional structures and frameworks going forwards. So it is a unique piece that we hadn't thought about deeply before, but when we've been looking at the work on the ground now, we know that there are some foundational elements to put in place to ensure disaster risk reduction happens. And one of those foundational elements is embedding, integrating disaster law so that people can respond more effectively and have a mandate to respond through the legal instruments.
And in terms of where we go from here, what are the key areas for capacity development of parliamentarians?
So I spoke a little bit earlier about foundational pieces, and capacity development is one of those foundational pieces that needs to be really brought forwards. So capacity development needs to be, when we're talking about the interconnectedness of or the different elements of the disaster, whether you're talking about climate or water, livelihoods, the legal instruments, there has to be capacity amongst parliamentarians to be able to understand and communicate across agencies. So capacity development around actually the issues at hand, and I suggest there needs to be a greater focus within universities at the postgraduate level to be able to create interdisciplinary courses so that people are better prepared when they leave university. But there also needs to be other pieces around capacity development, such as getting the data in, which I talked about Rainwatch earlier. Getting the data is one thing, but actually then being able to have the capacity to analyse that data, to understand what that data means, that's also a missing piece. So that there are all sorts of big areas of work that need to be done, but being able to communicate and work across those different disciplines and being able to analyse and interpret information that's available is also crucial. And another important area actually in this capacity development circuit is that there is often a very high turnover in these governments of parliamentarians, and so there is a need for a capacity development not just at the senior level but at the perhaps more stable middle levels of government. And I know that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that to support this turnover that can happen.
I very much hope that you find the different perspectives that have been explored during this masterclass to have been helpful and informative. So in concluding this masterclass, I would just like to end with a few questions in terms of where you as parliamentarians, in the critical role that you have in improving disaster risk reduction efforts, might go to. My first suggestion is to consider undertaking at the national level, if this has not been done already, a review of your existing codes, practices, legislation, to examine whether it covers particularly the most likely disaster-related events that you might suffer as a nation. In particular, thinking of how these might be prevented or the potential effects of them mitigated, or how you might be better prepared for them. It may not necessarily be the case that specific disaster risk reduction legislation is necessary for you. In some cases that may be, such as in the Philippines, but it might be that you look at your existing legislation and see whether subsequent revisions and amendments to make it more robust to respond to particular disaster events might be required. At the policy and also the practice level is to consider what these issues of better embedding, integrating those legal tools across different non-legal sectors might be, in furtherance of the agenda of having more multi-sectoral integrated responses. For example, your ministry that coordinates disaster responses, Are all relevant parties involved in the development of the framework and of the policies and your practices and related codes? Often it would seem that the legal element, it may be there, but not to the extent of its full potential in what it can offer, not least in offering stronger and better governance structures to existent science and technology and practical responses. So that concludes today's masterclass. I just want to thank you most sincerely for your time and your attention to the many critical issues that have been raised during it. And I wish you every success in your endeavours in taking these issues forward and helping to assist the legal and the non-legal goals of the Sendai framework and disaster risk reduction within your own respective states. Thank you.